So, good morning everyone, or good afternoon actually, it's just afternoon. And welcome to State Archives. My name is David Patterson and I'm the Manager of Engagement here at State Archives. And I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of the event today and pay my respects to elders past and present. And welcome everyone to our online audience as well. In partnership with Griffith University, today we're excited to present the QSA talk, Understanding Queensland Native Mounted Police, presented by Associate Professor Lynley Wallis. Queensland State Archives has had an ongoing partnership with Griffith University to present the Visiting Fellows Seminar Series. So far, the seminars have been presented by visiting fellows attached to the Harry Gentle Resource Centre and have been a great opportunity to see how historians use QSA records to further their research. However, today is a little special. Today we have Lynley Wallis, who has been leading a large-scale archaeology project investigating Native Mounted Police. Earlier this year, Queensland State Archives released its Statement of Intent in response to the Tandanya Declaration and to support the Queensland Government's Path to Treaty, particularly truth-telling and raising awareness of our shared history. State Archives is committed to questioning knowledge authorities, embracing First Nations worldviews and listening and learning from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Complementing Lynley's project, for the last 2 years, State Archive has been running the First Wars project. With research led by Dr. Jonathan Richards, the project explores frontier conflict throughout Queensland, as documented in the government records. As the research comes to a close, we are now looking forward to working with communities so we can share the research with respect and sensitivity. And we are very much looking forward to Lynley's talk today to see how archaeology and archival research are helping to tell the full history of our state. To introduce our speaker today, I'd like to welcome the Director of the Harry Gentle Resource Centre, Professor Mark Vernane. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, David, and thank you to all who are attending today here and also online. We're really pleased to be hosting this talk today about a topic that's really central to understanding the development of Queensland, obviously in the 19th century, but in terms of the memory of the place as a country and state that has a very troubled colonial history that it constantly needs to deal with and learn from. This is central to the research that will be discussed today. Just let me say a couple of things about the Harry Gentle Resource Centre. Some of you will have attended our talks here before. Harry Gentle was a student of Griffith University in the early 80s who undertook an arts degree and died a few years ago. In his will, he left a significant amount of money to the university with the intention of establishing a resource centre for the study of the early settlers of Queensland. The university gratefully accepted the bequest, and we've developed a resource centre that focuses on the history of the peoples of 19th century Australia, with a particular focus on early Queensland, the peoples of early Queensland, Indigenous peoples and settlers of that period. And it is that twofold interest of Indigenous and settlers that is a particular concern of the centre and has been the subject of much of the research of visiting fellows who've undertaken work with us over recent years, and some of whom have presented talks here. We offer, as part of our program, visiting fellowships, a number each year. We're about to advertise a new round of fellowships, and part of the role of visiting fellows is to undertake research that we can then make accessible and available to the public through our website and through other means, through publications and whatever form a visiting fellow might find productive, so that we increase the knowledge by the public of significant aspects of the history of Queensland. As David has indicated, usually these seminars are presented by visiting fellows of the centre. In this case, we're very pleased to have discussed with Lynley Wallis, Associate Professor in Archaeology at Griffith University, the possibility of presenting a talk on the major project that she's been involved with, looking at the history of the Queensland Native Police. Sometime back before the beginnings of COVID, I think it was, there was a major event that some people may have attended at the Queensland State Library, I think it was, launching the very impressive online database of this project, and I'm sure Lynley is going to show us some of the riches of that today. So I'm very pleased to be introducing Lynley to hear more about this project, one that's marked by a number of attributes which I think are really admirable in terms of scholarship. One is, very importantly, it's an interdisciplinary project. It's an archaeology project, but it draws on the skills of a wide range of disciplines. Secondly, somewhat unusually, I think in Australia, it's a multi-university project in this space, more common in archaeology than in many other disciplines, and it's been really impressive, both the process of the project and the dedication to making the results of their research known to the public through a range of formats. And this lecture today is one of those opportunities to learn more about this major project. Thank you.
Right. So thanks very much for that introduction, and thank you everyone for coming along today. As has been alluded to, I am actually just one member of our much larger team of half a dozen researchers, and I'm going to be telling you about this truth-telling journey that we've been on for the last 5 years or so, developing our interactive online database, which draws extensively on the resources of the Queensland State Archives. Before I go any further, I'd also like to pay my respects to the Jagera and Gerbil people, who are the traditional owners of these unceded lands on which the archives are located, and also a warning for any of our Indigenous audience members. I will be talking about deceased Aboriginal people, and there are some images, historical images of troopers, so I recognise that might be distressing to some viewers, so just wanted to put that warning out there first of all. So from the early 2000s, we've had extensive discourse in Australia dubbed the history wars about the nature of colonial settlement in this country. That word settlement implies that the process was peaceful and ordered, but the evidence suggests that this was clearly not the case. The 2017 Uluru Statement from the Heart, the call for constitutional recognition from Indigenous leaders across Australia, made reference to these history wars in the preceding regional dialogue meetings, which identified the fundamental need for knowing more about Australian and Aboriginal history in order for Australia to reconcile with its past. Consequently, truth-telling is surging to the forefront of the Australian lexicon. One transformative truth-telling initiative has been around massacres, a key element of which has been mapping. Now, I should point out that mapping massacre events is not a new endeavour. Ian Clark mapped massacres all across Victoria back in the 1980s in the pre-digital era. What is different today, however, is that our increasingly sophisticated geospatial interfaces allow online representations of these events, which move beyond these static single paper maps. Now, Lyndall Ryan and colleagues' Colonial Frontiers massacre map has been the most prominent online mapping exercise to date. Their map incorporates stringent criteria regarding the number of victims, which had to see at least 6 people killed, and it offers a level of confidence for each alleged incident. Initially, they focused on documenting the massacres that had happened in southeast Australia and have then since been moving around the rest of the country with adding information on a yearly regular basis. To date, there have been about 65 massacres of at least 6 people across Queensland. So I'm sure many of you are already familiar with this map, but if you're not, each of those dots represents an event which you can click into, and then you bring up a summary table about what happened at that particular location. So this one is for a 1966 massacre of Aboriginal people, 1866 massacre of Aboriginal people on the Baliando River. So the summary table gives you a little bit of basic information about the event, when it happened, where it happened, how many people were purported to be killed, and who the attackers were. In this instance, it was a Native Mounted Police force. And with this one, you can actually get a link directly to the Trove document, which refers to this killing. Quite a lot of the other references take you to a PDF which lists the references rather than throws you straight into the document itself. A derivative map and associated series of newspaper articles was subsequently published as The Killing Times by Guardian Australia, and I'm sure many of you will have read some of those articles. The Killing Times went on to win a Walkley Award, but unsurprisingly, it and its original iteration, Lyndall's map, have come under criticism by a lot of right-wing ideologues who've complained that the research underpinning both of them is fundamentally flawed. That's not a debate that I want to enter into here. Suffice to say that, in my opinion, the overall research is very solid. I have noticed that when you get into the very fine detail, there are some errors and some flaws, but I don't think that's unexpected given the nature of the research that's been undertaken and the broad scale of it. You know, we know there are a lot of complexities in interpreting and reconstructing the past. Another recent massacre map that you might not be quite so familiar with has been produced under the auspices of the Names of Places project led by artist Judy Watson. So this has been a unique collaboration between an artist, a historian and a spatial analyst. One of the obvious differences between this and the former map is that Judy set out to explicitly include oral history events there, whereas Lyndall always wanted a written documentary source to back up the oral evidence. So more often than not, this map does give you a direct link to the primary source file, which is often an inquest file, and you can read that material directly for yourself. Unfortunately, when I went to produce this PowerPoint, I discovered that the map is no longer accessible online, and I emailed Judy about that, and she said, yeah, look, we just don't know what's happened to it. We can't get it back ourselves. So it's really unfortunate with that online process that sometimes stuff is not as stable as you would like it to be, but hopefully they will get it back sooner rather than later. So while both of these maps are really useful in making the scale and spread of extreme frontier violence literally available at a glance, they are still limited in their scope. Both of them allows you to click on a particular event and bring up some information about it, and sometimes you'll be able to get back to the original source material. The relationship of any one event to any other event or to any contextual strands of information is very limited. You simply can't see it. And perhaps most importantly, these so-called massacre maps focus on what is arguably the more sensational events in our history. For Ryan, as I mentioned, the minimum criterion for an event's inclusion was the death of 6 people or more. This is a somewhat arbitrary figure and can be seen as being hurtful and upsetting to some other people, particularly when it suggests that an event, if only one person was killed, is of no significance. So they really focus on these sensational large-scale massacre events, and that belies the complexity of the frontier. These larger scale events were comparatively rare, so about 65 of them in Queensland alone over the course of more than 65 years. So you're only talking about one massacre event per year, which is, in the scale of things, not enormous. But usually they are the culmination of smaller scale events, many smaller scale events, over preceding weeks, months, and sometimes years. So we've argued that a more holistic approach to mapping violence on the frontier, regardless of whether it resulted in any or particularly large numbers of deaths, is needed to better understand the ebb and flow of interactions and the ever-changing negotiation of relationships, people and land on the frontier. So we set out to develop the Frontier Conflict and Native Mounted Police database. So for those of you who aren't familiar, and I assume that most of you probably are if you're listening to this talk, I'll just remind you a little bit about that Native Mounted Police Force in Queensland. So as a paramilitary force established to quell Indigenous resistance to Europeans usurping their traditional lands, they were a powerful instrument of colonial violence. They were predominantly Aboriginal men under the command of white officers, and they shifted along to follow the vanguard of settlement and exploration across the colony. They ultimately operated for more than 80 years, commencing in 1848 and going up until 1929. They both responded to requests from assistance from pastoralists and other settlements, but they also preemptively patrolled large areas around base camps which were established in suitable locations on the frontier. So as a government-sanctioned and financed body, their actions were widely endorsed both publicly and privately, though there were a few detractors. So the first detachment arrived on the Darling Downs in May 1849, when Queensland was still a part of New South Wales. They were under the command of the newly appointed Commandant, Frederick Walker, and he had brought with him 14 Aboriginal men who had been recruited from the Murrumbidgee and Murray River areas further south. From that beginning, that quite humble beginning, the force grew to have more than 900 troopers in it and more than 440 white officers. So, as I said, there were usually about 4 to 8 Aboriginal troopers under the command of one white officer. Often a detachment had a second white officer who was known as the camp keeper. They were often a constable, and they would typically stay in camp and look after the stores and the equipment when the detachment was out on patrol. So from a very large force, they eventually declined in size, with the camps being shut down as the frontier moved on. But not a lot of people know that the last camp was actually closed only in 1929 at Cohen in Cape York Peninsula. So knowledge of the force and its deeds disappeared from mainstream white consciousness until about 40 years ago, when historians such as Leslie Skinner, Noel Lewis, Henry Reynolds, Ray Evans, and then more recently Jonathan Richards and Timothy Bottoms began to shed light on their activities. This was part of the breaking of the Great Australian Silence and the dismantling of the cult of forgetfulness, described so eloquently by William Stanner in his 1968 Boyer lecture. So when we came to this, we were a group of archaeologists who had been working with Aboriginal people, sometimes for 30 years or more, and every Aboriginal community we met across Queensland, one of the first things they would do would be talk to us about the massacre narrative in their country and their experiences with the Native Mounted Police. So we talked to those communities about doing a project. We figured with a quite right-wing government, we might not be funded to do a major research project into massacres. So we thought one way into this was actually to look at the Native Mounted Police camps themselves, so to focus on the tangible evidence of what was out there. So we received an Australian Research Council Discovery grant for a project called the Archaeology of the Queensland Native Mounted Police, which set out to document the history and the material remains of the force. An important part of the project was sharing our findings with the public in new and innovative ways, and one of these was through our blog called Archaeology on the Frontier, through which we share with the general public aspects of our research, which the most recent we just posted yesterday, about the amazing Rockhampton letter book of George Murray, which dates from 1862 to 1866, and it was recorded in the archives as the Springshaw letter book, and it turned out to be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters written by George Murray during that 4-year period about the Native Mounted Police. So you can read a bit more about that on the blog. So that blog is being archived through the National Library as part of their Pandora project. So this is a bit of a summary of the project. So as mentioned, we are curating in this online database all of the archaeological materials as well as the historical research that we've done. So down here, you can see we've got literally tens of thousands of artefacts, all of which have been photographed, measured, catalogued and are in the database. Anybody can look them up and see what they look like, analyse. You can export the data yourself, play with it, see what was at each camp. We have identified 188 camps. These really come back to about 150 that we're very confident of. Some of them are districts rather than camps. And of those, we've visited a bit over nearly a third of them. So we've actually been out and ground truthed where they are on the ground, and then we did excavations at 8 of them. But what I really want to talk to you today are about the events of frontier conflict, so 2,182 of them and counting, so far more than 65 massacres, and also the sources that we've used to document those. So the database itself has a couple of interfaces where you can get into it if you haven't already. Frontierconflict.org takes you to this public interface. It also mentions that there's this other interface called the database.frontierconflict.org, which actually takes you into the back end, into the database itself directly. But the reason I wanted to mention this public interface is up the top here, you'll see we've got user guides. So if you do go and visit this website and you click on the user guides, you'll see there are 2 videos, short little 5-minute videos, one of which gives you really an overview of the project and the context of the database, and the other one takes you through the database step by step. There's also a user guide and some frequently asked questions. So if you do go straight to the database, this is what you see, and in order to log in, regardless of which interface, you have to set yourself up as a new user. Takes about 30 seconds and it's very painless, doesn't cost you anything, and once you've done that you'll be able to get in there and see everything that we have. So we really do recommend though that you go and have a look at those little videos and look at the FAQs, because there's a few little tricks in there. There's different views within the database and you think, why can't I see the map? And it might be because you're in the content view rather than the map view, so knowing about that will really help you. So what exactly is the database? Well, it's, rather than just being a map with a series of tables attached to it, it's a relational database which covers all elements of frontier conflict. So it's a comprehensive method of managing, storing, retrieving masses of complex interrelated information, the individual pieces of which are and can be related to each other. So rather than just presenting the dots on the map, it gives all of the information that underpins every one of those dots. It makes it available to the user, so if there are 50 documents that refer to an event, you will be able to read every single one of those 50 documents. You can download all of that data yourself, you can read all the source material yourself, and you can interrogate, analyse and interpret it yourself. So when we're talking relational database, this conceptually is what it looks like. It is a mess behind the scenes. So it's got the documents, it's got historical maps, it's got oral histories, it's got the archaeological sites, the artefacts, it's got information about all the personnel in the Native Mounted Police and all of the frontier conflict events. So rather than a single map being the outcome, it's a series of interactive maps that you can generate yourself. It recreates those complex webs of relationships which actually happen in the real world and allows you to look at events, when they happened, where they happened, and all of the people who were involved in those events in some way. So what this means is that instead of members of the general public who are interested in this having to try and find resources and come to the archives themselves and then wade through the unfamiliar systems, they can actually look at all of this material from their own lounge room on their own computer. And it just means that for researchers coming into this space, instead of having to reinvent the wheel, you can come here, all the materials collated, and you can look at that, get a quick overview and then build on it. So it allows people to, stand on the shoulders of those who came before, and we acknowledge unashamedly that we're standing on the shoulders of people like Noel Lewis and Jonathan Richards, whose books and publications we drew heavily on to set up the database in the first place. So in terms of sources that are in there, we have more than 15,000 documents in there, and that's actually more than 15,800 now, because just in the last few days I've added another 80. So I want to talk to you about those and also about these secondary sources that we have in there. So of those 15,000 or so documents, the great majority of them actually come from Trove. And what we actually did as part of our project was we systematically searched Trove for every single mention of Native Police, Native Mounted Police, any iteration of words we could come up with. We searched for every single officer's name in every context, and then we corrected all of the text in Trove before we then downloaded it and pulled it into the database. So you'll see I've done more than 250,000 lines of text. Heather Burke has done just as much as that as me. So all of that material is now pulled into this one location. So what these documents look like when you pull them in, we have a PDF version, it may be of the newspaper account, which you'll be familiar with from Trove or from the archive sources. So you can see the image of the document itself, but as well as that, we've actually transcribed every single one of those documents for you. So instead of you having to try and read that horrible cursive writing sometimes, we've actually done that. We've entered it in there. You can download this information. You can download the original PDF. And then we've cross-referenced who are the individuals and the places that are mentioned in every single document. So in terms of the archival material, we now have more than 5,000 individual documents uploaded from the archives. We obviously focused on the obvious sources, the police staff files, the police station files, the inquest files, but we've also used the amazing indexes to the colonial secretaries' correspondence and pulled in a lot of that material as well. Unfortunately, a lot of this archival material doesn't actually relate to frontier violence. It really relates to the administrative aspects of the Native Mounted Police, but it does give us a really good understanding of the bureaucracy and how it operated as a government force. The most obvious things which are missing are the daily journals, which were required to have been kept by every detachment. So this was mandated as part of the police regulations in the 1850s, and in 1866 it was expanded to require the keeping of 2 diaries. So the camp keeper had to keep a diary on their day-to-day activities in each police camp, and then the officer who was out on patrol had to keep a patrol diary as well. So as I said, we identified at least 150 camps which we're completely confident about. So if we assume that each sub-inspector and camp keeper from 1866 of those 150 camps kept their requisite diaries, there must have been a minimum of 260 journals outlining the activities of the Native Mounted Police. But only 4 such journals still survive today that have been located or found or are in the archives. So although we could expect some loss due to the transient nature of those camps and the frequent shifting of the detachments, the absence of almost all of those journals cannot solely be accidental. There must have been a deliberate purging of all of those journals from the historical records. So we also have some other resources in the database, which are labelled other. So these are not from Trove and not from the QSA. These are things like from other libraries, from diaries, letters, private resources that have been made available to us that are in there as well. As I mentioned, we also have a number of references in there. So these are the sources such as Jonathan Richards' book, journal articles that have been published on the Native Mounted Police or individual officers or frontier conflict events. So there are 456 of these. So unlike with the documents where we've put the original source in there as a PDF, many of these are under copyright, so we only have the bibliographic information in there. But we have cross-referenced them as well. So you can go in, look at the detail and see exactly which events and which people and which places are mentioned in every one of those 556 references. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the people of the Native Mounted Police and these people who are documented in that database. So far we've identified 442 officers, 927 Aboriginal troopers and more than 2,000 other associated individuals. So very quickly telling you a little bit about these. With these officers, the 442, 173 of these individuals were not identified by Jonathan in his research. So it substantially increases our understanding of that force. We have varying degrees of information about these. Some of these individuals we have one single mention in a secondary letter. Others we have enormous police staff files about them, and those are usually the men who had long careers in the force. They were transferred out of the Native Police into the regular force, and so they have a lot of documentation about them. Unfortunately, almost all of that documentation in their police staff files relates to their non-Native Police careers. Of course, with this, it's really difficult tracking these individuals through the historical sources. If you look at the vagaries of 19th century journalism, journalists often didn't know the difference between Thompson, and or between the various Murray brothers and the various Walker brothers who were in the force. So it gets very complicated trying to work out who they were talking about. But every one of these individuals has a reference. You can click into them and you will bring up a record that looks something like this. So this is the record of John de Linden Affleck. You can see on the side here, this is all the cross-reference material. So we've got one blog post that talks about him, 49 documents in the database. He was involved in 3 events of frontier conflict that we've been able to track. He had one posting where we know who his commanding officer was, and 6 postings to different police camps. And there are 2 books that actually talk about him. So we've tried to collate a series of biogeographical information about these individuals, so birth dates, death dates, who they were married to, and then write a précis of that individual. So we're still working on these. You can imagine with 400 of them, we're churning through them. So the ones with the officers who have almost no information are really quick to write, but some of the guys who had 20 or 30 year histories with the force are very difficult to write. So from this we can, because all of that information is there, it's very easy for everyone else to pull it down in a CSV file, and then you can start to summarise what's going on there. So none of this is particularly interesting or useful for you to know, but, we can see there were 44 men in the force who were called John, and there were 36 men whose wives were called Mary, but there were actually 5 who were called John with a wife called Mary, and 2 of them were both called John Kenny, whose wives were Mary. So you can imagine trying to track those individuals through the records were incredibly difficult. But it is now something that we can actually do, and we're starting to interrogate the data in that way. With the troopers, we have a lot less information, although these men were also fully paid members of the Queensland Force, and they were, just like the white officers, given individual register numbers. There is not a single staff file for any of them that we've been able to locate, and often we only know a single mention of these men in one particular document. One of the difficulties is that in the early years of the force, the Aboriginal troopers were often allowed to retain their actual names, their Aboriginal names, which makes tracking them in the early years quite easy. In the later years of the force, they were not given that dignity. They were just given a whitefella name, and often we've had to resort to saying, oh, well, we've got Albert 1, Albert 2, Albert 3, Albert 4, Albert 5 to try and distinguish between those different men. We do try, when we've come up with an individual who we think might be the same person, we've indicated that, so Albert 4 and 5 might actually be the same person, but at the moment on the evidence we have, we just don't know. This is the trooper that we have the most information about, Jackie Stiles. He was actually in the force for 21 years. So by doing this, we've actually been able to track what happens with those troopers in the force. And rather than being a really transient force, a lot of those Aboriginal men were there for a very long period of time. So he was not alone in being there for 21 years. There are certainly other individuals we've tracked for 13, 14, 15 years. And there was a strong push amongst the sort of bureaucracy and the senior members of the force to try and retain those older troopers by offering them bonuses and getting them to re-sign on. So the fact that some individuals serve for such a long period of time does suggest that not all elements of that force were really distasteful and unpleasant. For at least some of those Aboriginal troopers, they did find some level of security, and they must have, I wouldn't say enjoyed what they did, but maybe they found a camaraderie, or they found a place in the world in this very complicated landscape they had found themselves in. So, as I said, with the troopers, because we know such a small amount of detail about them, we only know for about a quarter of them where they came from, and of those, 47 actually came from Maryborough. So that was a particularly important area for recruitment. We only have photos of 16 of those men. So while we have quite a few photos of the Native Mounted Police, often it's only the white officer who is named. So, but by trying to figure out, by knowing which officer was where and who the troopers were in his detachment, and knowing when that photograph was taken, we've sometimes been able to identify and say, well, at least those 5 individuals include these men. We don't know who is who at this stage. But we do know that 133 of them deserted, which is a quite large number. Of the associated individuals, there are more than a couple of thousand. So these are people who might have been the victims of attacks. They might have been non-Native Mounted Police officers, so officers in the regular force. They might have been police magistrates, the squatters, the landowners, anyone who had anything to do with the Native Mounted Police. And you can see, obviously, lots of station owners mentioned, lots of workers, labourers and shepherds mentioned. Here, one thing it's really easy to forget from our 21st century viewpoint is just how small that white population of Queensland was in the 19th century. There were only 23,000 people in Queensland in 1859, and that rose to about 500,000 in 1901, a quarter of whom were living in Brisbane and the surrounds. So when you start to cross-reference all these individuals in all of those historical documents, you realise that there were very few degrees of separation. If you yourself if you were not directly involved in frontier conflict yourself, you knew somebody who had been, or you knew that it was going on. So there is no hiding to suggest that people didn't know what was happening. The community was so small, everybody would have known what was going on, whether they chose to speak about it or write about it or not. So we see the same people's names coming up over and over and over again, and it just reinforces that knowledge that we had, that it was a very small, closed white community in early Queensland, and the pastoralists were actually the politicians making the laws about this. There was a very strong conflict of interest going on here. So certain individuals show up all the time in those records, and you can track those individuals. So one particularly interesting individual is the medical officer up in Cooktown during the years of the Palmer Gold Rush, and his name was Helmuth Axel Friedrich Bernhard Kortium. So he was a medical practitioner in Cooktown, and he was often treating victims of spearings. So he appears all the time in the newspaper accounts and in inquests as well. So in terms of our map interface, what we have is rather than one static map, is a whole series of maps that you can create yourself. So there are different layers which you can turn on and off yourself. So these are things like the mineral fields are in there, the river systems, the pastoral districts, the current native title claims, Aboriginal language groups. We plotted the location of every telegraph station because that was really important in getting news out and calling in the Native Mounted Police. And of course, we've plotted the location of all of those Native Mounted Police camps that we've been able to identify, which had never not been done before. And then, of course, there are all the events of frontier conflict. So talking about those events of frontier conflict, I mentioned that we've documented 2,182 and we're increasing that on a weekly basis. So rather than the massacre maps, which focus only on events where 6 people or more were killed, we set out to catalogue all of the elements of frontier conflict. So these, for the ease of analysis, we separated these into attacks on stock or property, attacks on Aboriginal people, attacks on Europeans, and when we say Europeans, we mean effectively non-Indigenous people, so they might have been Chinese miners, and then attacks on detachments of the Native Mounted Police themselves. When we talk about attacks on stock or property, we include both attacks on Aboriginal camps, such as when their camps were raided, their humpies were burned down, which happened a lot around Brisbane, as well as attacks on European property, such as when shepherds' huts were ransacked or the carriers' drays were robbed. So every single one of these events has a record in the database. So this is a killing of Aboriginal people on Yambakal Station in 1852. You can see there are 6 documents that make reference to this event, and there are actually 2 related events. So this attack on Aboriginal people didn't happen out of the blue. There were things that had happened before it that led up to it, and the database allows you to see those. So you can see a map, you can see where it happened. You can actually see in this one there are actually 3 events. One of them happened a year before this attack on the Aboriginal people. These were the 2 attacks beforehand. So there was attacks on stock in April and May, and then in response to that, the Aboriginal people were attacked by the Native Mounted Police. So you can see we've documented who the perpetrators were, the names of the individual troopers, which we were able to figure out in this instance, and then you can see all of the written descriptions of that account, of that event. You can see all the cross-referenced links, so who are the officers, who are the troopers. You can click on these and follow them all through. You can go down and see those 6 documents. Every one of those is an active link. You click into it, and you will see the original PDF document and then the TypeScript version of it, again, cross-referenced, so you can follow any event, any individual through time. So what does all this mean? So it allows us to build up this much more complex picture of what was happening on the frontier. So if we go back, and I don't mean to pick on Lyndall, but I just want to make the point that it's much more complex than just those massacres. So southeast Queensland with the 6 massacre events that happened here. If we then add in all of the attacks against Aboriginal people, you start to see there's quite a lot more than just 6. Then we add in the attacks against Europeans. Again, it's much wider spread. Then we add in the attacks against the Native Mounted Police, which it's very hard to see, but there's a series of these light blue dots in here. And then all of the attacks against stock or property. So we go from having a map that looks like this, very empty, to a map that looks like this with very full. Now, where we have these big expanses with nothing going on, that is not a reflection that nothing happened out there. It's more a reflection of the fact that Aboriginal deaths were rarely reported. Every time a single individual European was killed, it was written about ad nauseum in the newspapers. We have lots of challenges in mapping accurately those locations, which is a problem that all of the people who've attempted to do this, so often you'll be told, oh, there was a massacre on the Fitzroy River. How do you map that? When was the massacre? So we have a lot of events mentioned in documents that haven't actually been mapped because we physically can't put a dot on the map. And of course, literacy amongst Europeans, particularly in some of these outback pastoral areas, was very low, but obviously amongst Aboriginal people was almost non-existent. So they simply didn't get to tell their stories in a lot of the written sources. So what does this reveal to us about numbers of deaths? Well, Robert Orsted, Jensen and Ray Evans came up with a figure of about 41,000 based on an average life of a camp being about 7 years and based on there being a certain number of camps. Because we've been able to expand the number of camps and because we know how long those camps operated for, the absolute minimum number of Aboriginal deaths has to have been at least 60,000, and depending on how you play those numbers, it's probably far higher than that, and it's more likely to be about 100,000.
In Queensland?
In Queensland alone, by the Native Mounted Police. So you can do things with our data. These are the attacks against Aboriginal people by year, and remember, these are only the ones that we've been able to map. So you can sort of see, trends in that data. So by the late 1800s, early 1900s, far fewer attacks against Aboriginal people. Is that really the case, or are people just not talking about it as much? And you can see attacks against Europeans by Aboriginal people themselves as well. So just in closing, really, just the database, this just plots the number of users through time. So far about nearly 700 people have been accessing the database, and most of them are people with a general interest. We've got some secondary students because of the National History curriculum, and we've had great support from staff at All Hallows School in particular, Vince Wall, in running professional development projects, where we've been able to talk to teachers and get kids involved in this. But it's fantastic to see that nearly 200 people have just been accessing this database just out of their own general interest, which I think speaks to that point that the general public is interested in what happened. They want to engage in that truth-telling initiative. And when we break it down into people's backgrounds, the great bulk of people accessing the database are non-Indigenous. This is not just something that Aboriginal people are interested in. They already know this. It's been handed down in their family histories. This is something that members of the wider community are interested in learning more about. So the history of frontier conflict in Australia at once surrounds us, yet at the same time it's still literally and figuratively hidden from view. The oftentimes fierce debates about whether what happened constituted an actual war, about how many people might have been killed as a result, and whether contemporary Australia should recognise these events, complicates the way we look upon the past and the way we make the past look to us. For the descendants of frontier violence survivors, Aboriginal troopers and Native Mounted Police officers, these stories are their family histories. They define who they are, where they come from, and how they see themselves today. Our database provides anyone interested with a new opportunity to understand this, both as a general process and for those living in Queensland as a fundamental part of the history of the region. There is no single story of the Native Mounted Police. Its history is as broad as the hundreds of officers and troopers who constituted it, and is as deep as the personal choices, actions and reactions that contributed to the decades of violence and unrest as people and worldviews collided on the Queensland frontier. By allowing people to access the evidence for themselves, everyone can now investigate the nature of frontier conflict. They can critically assess it and come to their own conclusions about what happened, why and how. This is a powerful contribution to any truth-telling exercise, although how it will play out socially, psychologically and culturally remains to be seen. But if you haven't already done so, we invite you to have a look at the database and actively engage in the truth-telling of your own. Thank you.
Wow. That's an incredible project. Thanks, Lynley. And yeah, I really encourage anybody to have a look at the database. It's a gold mine. It represents so much work and it's fantastic for anybody interested in the area, educators, students and the general public. It's an amazing piece of work. I have so many questions, but I'm not going to ask them right now. I'm going to open it up to the audience. So we're going to ask questions of the audience here at State Archives and also online. So we have Chad, who has the microphone, who's willing to roam around for anybody who has a question. So if you do want to ask a question of Lynley, just stick your hand up. And Alicia is also online and taking questions from our online audience as well. So we have the first question.
Hello, I'm Trish Fitzsimons and I've done some historical work around the Channel Country. First of all, respect Lynley, like it's an incredible undertaking, and even just the you and colleagues taking the handwriting of documents and getting an agreed kind of workable transcript. Extraordinary. So the question I'm going to ask is like the limit case, all right, and doesn't in any sense underpin what you've done. But I want to ask about sexual violence because Jude Watson in her TED talk recently talked about drovers' boys that being young Aboriginal women that were, you know, for the use and abuse of, well, I'm making assumptions here. Anyway, I watched this and I was suddenly looking at, for instance, Helen Tolscher's story of John Conrick, and I look at the photo and I think, bloody hell, you know, what's said to be just, you know, the squatter and his boys or whatever, it's clearly young women. How the hell in the capturing all violence on the frontier? So look, it might seem like an unfair question, but it's asked with respect.
No, and thank you for it. It is something that we've spoken a lot, particularly Heather Burke and I. We do document sexual violence on the frontier, but as you can imagine, it's not written about very often. You know, it was a very taboo topic, and when it did make the newspapers and when there were trials, they were very sensational and they were reported on, and all of those instances are in there. And we do have keywords around sexual violence, rape, assault, Aboriginal women, European women. And one of the things that we do people tend to think more about is sexual violence against Aboriginal women who were being kidnapped after massacre events and being handed over to the troopers. And we know that there were women in almost all of these camps. There was a vibrant family life going on, and they had children. There was also white officers who were clearly taking Aboriginal women for their own purposes. Sometimes they may have been genuine relationships, but we ask, how much of a free and informed choice could Aboriginal women make in that situation? And of course, it's just not documented. Most of it would have happened and not ever been written about. But we have tried to capture that, and you can particularly search for that there. But I suspect it's massively underreported. But there was also this sexual violence against European women as well, and that's what I think is actually really interesting and has been very underreported because sexual violence is a weapon of war. And I think it was being used on both sides in Queensland's frontier wars, which I don't think comes out very much. So thanks for the question. And we should really talk about the Channel Country because I've spent a lot of time out there. So
I've got 70 hours of transcripts and interviews. And
fabulous. Let's talk.
could be valuable.
My name's John Browning. Can you just indicate a little bit about what archaeological evidence has taught you?
Sorry, what archaeological?
The archaeological evidence has taught you?
Probably that camp life was very dull. Of course, the camps themselves are not where the violence happens. The camps are the bases from which the detachments go out. So they were very mundane. There were suggestions that the camps would be located in easily defended areas, and this was not the case at all. The thing that determined where a camp was simply where is there water and where is there good feed for the horses. It wasn't about defence at all. There was a massive amount of alcohol being consumed in those camps, which particularly based on the Borelga camp, which we have good stratified deposits from and clear trooper areas and officers' areas, almost all of that alcohol was being consumed by the white officers. And that indicates to us that there was probably a large amount of PTSD amongst the officers, and they were self-medicating. This was one of the only ways they could try and deal with what they were being required to do on a daily basis. That thing of the women and children, we sort of knew in an abstract way that there were women and children in these camps, but we found toys, toy guns, toy marbles, toy dolls, toy doll sets, little tea sets, just adorable, but really brings home to you, that these were sort of little bastions of domesticity out in this wild frontier. And we just hadn't really had that sense of it, I think, beforehand. And just being able to physically map all those locations and realise that when you're out in the Channel Country, you're talking about 300 kilometres between the camps. When you go up to somewhere like the Palmer River, which is incredibly rugged country where all the advantages of horseback disappear, the camps are 7 to 20 kilometres apart. They're not 300 kilometres apart. So sort of that was the archaeological landscape approach, gave us a much better sense of that ebb and flow and where the extreme violence was happening, where the extreme interactions were going on.
Yeah, good day, Woodeld. I've got a question. You've just raised the figures of deaths, maybe up to 100,000. What was done to these men to make them do what they did? Surely we've got numbers of missing police journals, higher number of deserters. Was there any evidence that their own groups were sent out to hunt deserters down?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely.
So, would that be something that could also be told to us, the other side of the story, what was done to these men?
Oh, absolutely, and it's very, very hard to get into that side of, why did these men partake in this? And we've written extensively about that. We've written about recruitment and what some of the motivating factors were. We think in a lot of instances, the men who were signed up to the force, the Aboriginal men in particular, didn't really understand at the outset what they were going to be asked to do. And we tried to put ourselves, as much as you can, from a white female context, to imagine how you as an Aboriginal person, often a young man, and often these were very young men, how you end up joining this force and doing that for so many years. And I think you have to try and understand that Aboriginal life had been so enormously uprooted and changed and impacted by deaths, and not just violence, but deliberate death, but death from disease. So their traditional subsistence cycles had been interrupted. The water holes, which had once been important to them, had been taken over by pastoralists. They were moved out of those areas. They'd probably seen a lot of killings themselves of their own people. The ceremonial cycles and movements were no longer happening. People were often not being initiated in the same ways, and they had no respect from white people, so there were often very few choices available to Aboriginal people in this period, we think. So, is it a choice? Is it really a choice to join the Native Mounted Police when there are very few other options available to you? So it's the choiceless choice. And for some people, this was just a way of surviving. Now, we have heard stories from families of troopers who tell us that sometimes the stories that were handed down in their families was that their great-grandfathers did everything they could to let people escape, that they would try and get warnings out to people if they knew they were going to be headed out on patrol somewhere. They would try and pass warnings so that Aboriginal people could disappear before they got there. They talked about their relatives shooting over the heads of Aboriginal people rather than into them. And we know from the numbers of desertions that certainly a lot of Aboriginal people, when these men signed up and they got there and they realised what they were going to be required to do, they tried to get away, and they were once somebody deserted, they were hunted down by the remaining police force, particularly if they took weapons or horses with them. And not only did they then have to evade the other troopers who might not have deserted with them, but they also had to go through hostile territory. So remember, troopers were recruited from somewhere else and often moved 1,000 or 2,000 kilometres away from where they came from, into what was effectively alien territory, and those Aboriginal people whose territory it was that they were then trying to pass through would also have been on the lookout for them. And we know instances of where troopers were killed by Aboriginal people passing through their country. And actually Jackie Stiles, the man who served for 21 years, he was murdered by other Aboriginal people just before his retirement. Now, whether that was because of his actions in the Native Mounted Police or some other transgression, we do not know. But there was certainly enormous fear amongst the white population about deserted troopers who knew about the patrols, who knew about how guns worked, and who were often seen as then becoming guerrilla, leaders who would join up with an Aboriginal group and then lead sorties against the Native Police or against pastoral stations. So, but yeah, it is very hard to understand how and why. But I think when you look at that context of just how much disruption there was to Aboriginal lifeways, that a lot of these people just had no other genuine choice.
So given that, like you mentioned, the mob from Maryborough had 43 and it was a significant contributor, so to speak, do you think the geographical segregation, moving people 1,000, 1,500 kilometres from country, was it a tool in that war?
Oh, absolutely.
A tool in making them...
It was very much a deliberate tool. It was a deliberate choice of the Queensland government to do that. And they knew that if they couldn't expect Aboriginal people to go and shoot their own relatives who they had close relationships with, so they deliberately made men go and serve somewhere quite differently. And there are complaints, even in this letter book that we've just found from George Murray, where he talks about these recruits from this area, I have concerns about having them serve so close to their own country. I think they're a real desertion risk. So it was clear that they knew that to prevent desertion, the further away you move those men from their own country, the better the chances would be that they were then trapped in that force and would have to keep serving.
We've got a question from our online audience here. Did you notice any change at the time of Federation as a turning point in history?
Sorry,
did you notice any change at the time of Federation as a turning point?
Yes and no. As I said, by that stage, most of the police camps had been closed, and really the only one that was properly still operating was the camp up at Cohen in far north Cape York Peninsula. Before then, even before Federation, we saw troopers they had decided to get rid of that language. They had decided to shut a lot of the camps, and they had moved. Troopers who wanted to continue in the force became attached to the regular police force, and then they became termed trackers. And one of the things we have noticed in talking to descendant families is people are saying, oh, you know, my great-grandfather was a tracker with the police. Very few people say my great-grandfather was a trooper. So there was sort of a cleaning up of the language, that it was fine to be a tracker with the regular police, it was not fine to be a trooper with the Native Mounted Police. But in fact, often those men were the same men. And certainly I think after Federation, you know, you have the 1897 Act coming into Queensland with protectors, and, you know, people, then Aboriginal people came under the Act, and there were permits, and there was much more of an attempt by the government to regulate Aboriginal people rather than continue to try and exterminate them, which had been the previous approach.
Thank you very much. That was amazing. So could everybody please put your hands together for the And thank you to Mark and Harry Gentle, Resource Centre, and to Lee Butterworth as well, and everybody who's helped out, and of course everyone behind the scenes at QSA staff, and for everybody online, please stay in touch, and we look forward to you joining our next QSA talk. Thanks very much.